Public Television's Great Lakes Bureau, greatlakesnow.org. We are in Buffalo at the 15th Annual Great Lakes Restoration Conference put on by Healing Our Waters. Just listen to a fascinating panel on the effects of the ethanol mandate, particularly on the Great Lakes. We talked a lot about that and land. And could you please identify yourself? Thank you so much for talking with us, and say your name and title.
My pleasure. I'm David DeGennaro. I'm an agriculture policy specialist with the National Wildlife Federation.
So there were some shocking things we learned about the effects of the ethanol mandate, and you had a researcher who looked at some things along with you, Chris Wright, and you talked about it as well, really focusing on the Great Lakes and the impact of the ethanol mandate. One of the shocking things that maybe you could explain is how much acreage has been used, and Michigan was named as one of the states that has the most acreage that has had crop conversion caused by this. Is that correct?
Yeah, Michigan has had a lot of conversion in the Great Lakes Basin. Some of the other farmland, like they mentioned in Ohio, east or west of Lake Erie, had already been converted, was already in corn production. So it was those areas outside of the traditional corn belt that saw a lot of conversion. So that's why Michigan, Wisconsin saw some of that. But nationwide, from 2008 to 2012, 7 million acres of land were converted to crop production. So that was mostly grasslands, but even forest land and wetlands were converted into crop production. Most of that went to corn, a lot of that for the ethanol mandate itself, but then as corn was displacing other crops, some of that conversion was to produce those other crops in new places.
So can you just explain a little bit more what happens to places like the Great Lakes, and particularly Lake Erie, when you do a large amount? I think you mentioned that there isn't even any more crop area to be converted anymore in western Lake Erie. And talk about the impact on the lakes.
Sure. Well, now 40% of our corn crop goes to ethanol production rather than to food or to feed animals. And so that big demand for corn led to this massive conversion that we've seen, but also to intensification on existing lands. So places like Ohio, where there was already corn production going on, they doubled down and tripled down on their corn production. So producing corn year after year rather than rotation with other crops, planting right up to the edge of waterways rather than buffer strips and things like that, and really putting lots of fertilizer on to maximize the output. So all of that intense agriculture on these lands leads to more runoff, especially in the face of more intense storms that we've seen and wetter weather in this region. So that means more farm runoff, more chemicals, more fertilizers go into our waterways, which end up in places like Lake Erie, which leads to the massive algal blooms that we see.
Could you talk about, one of the shocking things you said also is it's absolutely proven that ethanol has not been advantageous with what's happening with climate. In
Right.
fact, gasoline is better than ethanol. Is that, can you state it in the proper way? I did not.
Yeah, there was projected that traditional corn ethanol is supposed to reduce greenhouse gases by about 20% from gasoline. But in reality, especially when you take into account all of this land conversion that we've seen, when you plow up soils and plant crops for the first time, you release a tremendous amount of carbon into the air that had been stored in the soils. And that hadn't really been accounted for. And so when you take all of that into account, actually, people like the University of Michigan are saying that it's worse for the climate than gasoline itself. So while this was supposed to be a green policy that was supposed to help us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, we've probably made them worse.
You had some recommendations about what we do here and how we protect our wetlands and grasslands and try to get things back in balance, especially with climate change. What can people do?
Well, they need to ask their members of Congress to support changing the law. The Renewable Fuel Standard, which was passed in 2007, it really has not worked as it was supposed to, and it's time to fix the law. And members of Congress need to know that, and they need to make this a priority. And what they can do is they can lower the overall mandate, particularly for corn and soybeans, corn ethanol and soy, biodiesel, and really refocus the law on some of those more beneficial fuels made from things like corn stalks and wood waste and municipal solid waste, algae, those things that have a much better footprint, won't hurt water quality, and will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then also better funding for conservation of land to keep land that's not in production out of production, and then to help restore some of those lands that have been converted into agriculture.
Do you have hope that things will change? There is an unusual thing going on in Washington, D.C. right now involving the EPA and involving federal regulations.
I do like to be hopeful. It's definitely going to be an uphill battle, but there are lots of people from both sides of the political spectrum, from all kinds of different industries all around the country, who care about this and who want to see the law change and updated based on what we know now. And so that gives us the rare opportunity for members of Congress from both sides to work together and really see some progress happen. So we're working really hard to try and move the ball forward this fall and hopefully into next year.